Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to my lecture on debating and outweighing principles, presented by yours truly, Rodrigo Trujillo. Um, we are very obviously going to talk about principles. You can expect a couple of things in this lecture. We're just going to talk about some basic principles, a lot of principles. I don't know, just like common principles, and how to really debate principles. Because usually, what I see in debate rounds is a lot of people throw around the word principle without actually knowing how to efficiently make a principled argument or how to actually make it matter on the ballot, right? And so hopefully this lecture helps out a couple of you at least, but that's the goal. So here are the materials we're going to be using in this lecture. Um, we're going to first talk about what a principle is, give a brief overview because I'm sure you guys have already learned a bit about it. We're going to go over the most intuitive principles, the most commonly accepted and most commonly used. Then we'll talk about refuting principles explicitly but not strategically. And then we'll go on to refuting principles strategically but not explicitly. And then we'll talk about weighing principles against each other, against the practical, against anything really. And then we'll finish off with some resources that might help you guys out. So let's waste no time and talk about what a principle actually is. So I think that a principle argument is a universal claim that truth does not rely on any practical outcomes. What this means is that it works parallel to the practical, that it applies to everyone, and that it is an argument that actually matters, right? So what makes a principle a principle? I think that what makes a principle a good principle is usually what it's grounded in and what it's like the ideas that it's founded upon, right? Think about things like past grievances, right? Evils that have been committed towards certain groups, whatever, or any variance of justice, whether it be retribution, rehabilitative, restorative, whatever. Moral obligations from one actor to another, and individual rights and personal freedoms. These are usually what principles are founded in, and I think these are the most common principles and a common theme that you will see reoccur in like various debates, right? But I think what really makes a principle a good principle is its a universality. And so the strongest principles are always going to be universal, right? So, for example, if we're debating a nice motion about this house would abolish the private schools, a bad opposition principle would say, people have the right to equality education, whatever, right? And therefore, like, we should like maintain private schools because private schools are good education and people have a right to have good education, right? And so the reason this is a bad principle is because it's not universal, right? Like, I mean, who cares if rich people can like go to private schools? The right to quality education is exclusive to the rich if it's only available in private schools, right? That's the reason it's a bad principle. So you want to avoid making things that are not universal. You want to make arguments that are universal available to everyone, regardless of any of that class status, whatever, right? So I think a good principle that we could like find on emotion, like this has to make physiological needs like water, food, and healthcare a part of the Constitution. You'd probably make a good principle about how the government should guarantee its rights to all of its people, regardless of class, race, status, whatever, right? And the reason that's a good principle is because it's universal, right? Like everyone needs food, everyone needs water, everyone needs healthcare, and because it'd be a constitutional right, it would be distributed. That right would be distributed equally among people, regardless of things like class, race, status, economic sustainability, anything really. Like that is what makes it a universal principle. That is what makes it a far better principle than the principle that we talked about before, right? But also I think the principles should be parallel to the practical, right? Like you do not want your principle to be close to any sort of practical implications. And the more independent your principle is, the better your principle will work in rounds because you can get absolutely obliterated on the practical, but if you still have a independent principle, that is still ultimately a reason that the judge should vote for your side of the house, especially if they did not win or if they didn't give a principal argument. That's like a clean spot on the ballot where you're ahead, right? And so I think the best way to make principles as independent as possible is through avoiding any assumptions or any practical assertions to set up your principle, and avoiding relying on any practical outcomes to like beef up your principle, right? So back on the example that we used before about the private schools motion or whatever, like a proposition on that motion would be like abolishing private schools is principally necessary because it increases the quality of public education and everyone has a right to equal and like good quality education, right? The reason why that's bad is because firstly, it practically asserts that like the private schools are the only reason why public education is bad. And secondly, it relies on the outcome that education for public schools actually does increase and in quality for your right to like equal good education to be like fulfilled, right? So you want to avoid making principal claims that are intertwined with the practical, right? You don't want that. But yeah, so now let's talk about the most common principles and the most widely accepted, the most widely used, whatever, right? And if you're like if you are someone who like likes to make principles, you should probably take notes on this just because like, or if you want to use principles more often, like these are the most common principles that you're going to run into, and I'll be explaining like each of them independently, right? So firstly, you have the principle of dependency, right? And the principle of dependency states that if one party is dependent on another party for something extremely important, like life, dignity, economic security, essential rights, whatever, then it is the responsibility of the party of that party to provide for the other that is dependent on them, right? So, for example, a parent probably has the moral obligation to care for a child because that child is dependent on that parent for things like their food, like their safety, whatever, right? That is sort of like principle of dependency in real world applications. In debate land, if you're like debating a motion about, I think that there is this motion about like adult children taking care of their parents after like a certain age or whatever, like living in the same household as them or whatever. There is a principle on the proposition where you're like, look, this elderly parent can no longer like take care of themselves. Therefore, the child or their kid has the principle of dependency or the principal obligation to take care of them because the elderly is dependent on their children, right? Like stuff like that is how you use this principle in real world, in real like rounds, whatever. The second principle is the principle of essential rights. This is one of the most intuitive principles, right? This principle of essential rights has to do with any arguments of any rights that are essential, things like personal freedoms, civil liberties, physiological needs, whatever. All of those things are deemed essential rights. And I think that it happens on two levels. First is the physiological level, right? Where you have basic human needs. Like think about anything that humans need to survive. Things like safety, shelter, food, water, air, etc. If you're thinking about it philosophically, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the first two levels of the pyramid are the physiological levels or the safety levels. These are essential human rights that people need to survive. Secondly, there's the institutional level, right? And this is more of like the rights that the government ought to guarantee its citizens that have to do outside of the physiological needs, right? Things like constitutional rights, equal representation, your right to expression, your right to income or economic sustainability. All of that has to do with institutionally given essential rights. And you argue that all of these things are important because if they aren't, then like the government is like not fulfilling their responsibilities, right? Then you have a really, really common principle that I see a lot of teams use, but not use well enough. And it's the principle of reparations, right? And so the principle of reparations, or also called reparative or restorative justice, suggests that if something was taken from you, it must be returned or repaired in the exact way or form that it was taken, right? So for example, slavery was like objectively injustice because America took away several rights away from African Americans. Things like the right to vote, the right to income, economic security, property, like dignity, everything, like pretty much everything, to be honest. And therefore, things like granting African Americans constitutional rights, monetary reparations, human ontological dignity is principally necessary because we've never given them that before, right? So you want to be very strategic with how you fulfill your principle, because if your policy on the proposition only gives African Americans voting rights, but not like monetary reparations or any of the other constitutional rights, that's not actually reparative, right? Because you're only giving them a small portion of what was actually taken, and you're not returning that in the exact way or form that it was actually taken in the first place, right? So you want to be very, very careful when making these type of arguments. The second, or no, the last thing, the second to last thing is social contract theory. So the social contract theory or mandate is a principle that suggests that if a group of people give away some freedoms to the government, then the government is always obliged to work in their favor. So for example, a person in Australia sacrifices their right to own a gun in exchange for the Australian government to ensure that nobody owns a gun because you gave away a freedom and the government uses that to create a better society, right? And if you apply this to like more universal claims that you'll probably run into in rounds. Things like paying taxes are probably a common theme. So like, for example, paying taxes strips the individual of some financial freedom, but in return, the government uses that money to support their best interests, things like for supporting welfare, social programs, healthcare, the military, or whatever. Like all of that is publicly funded using taxes. And this is just an example of how social contract theory works in the real world. So let's do let's do a drill. It's drill time, guys. So I want you to like using like the last four principles we just talked about. I want you to come up with as many principles as you can on this motion. But if you like can come up with like other ones, like other principles, you should probably do that too. But try using these last four principles, right? So let's say you're debating the mission. This house would make the weight of an individual's vote proportional to their expected remaining lifespan. Try and use the four principles we talked about earlier to come up with actual like arguments, as many as you can, and we'll kind of circle back and talk about it in a bit. Cool. So hopefully you were able to pause and come up with some arguments. Now let's talk about these arguments. So let's say, boom, we're debating this awesome motion on this house would make the weight of an individual's vote proportional to their expected remaining lifespan. What are the principles that we can argue, right? The immediate one that comes to mind is the principle of essential rights. Why? Because remember, the institutional level of rights that we talked about was equal representation, right? The government gives everyone their right to vote, and therefore, because of that right, they also have to like equally represent everyone, whatever, right? And obviously, passing proposition's policy of making the weight of an individual's vote proportional to their expected remaining lifespan is going to be bad because it actually infringes upon this upon that principle. I think another principle that you can make is things like social contract theory, right? Like this policy is pretty much obviously going to harm like the elderly since they are probably going to die first. So you'd argue that the elderly pay taxes same as everyone else. The elderly like contributes to society same as everyone else, and therefore, if the government like represents them less in government, then they're not fulfilling the social contract theory because they're not working in those individuals' like best interests, right? In their favor. You'd argue that the social contract theory is only like being fulfilled on the front end, and the government isn't like fulfilling their part, right? The last principle that I think you could probably use on the opposition is your like the principle of dependency, right? Because you'd be like, look, elderly people are super reliant on the government for things like healthcare, quality of healthcare, policies that impact things like I don't know, like retirement and all those different things like social programs, etc. The elderly is relying on the government, and if their vote is weighs less just because of their age, something that they cannot control, then that is principally wrong because they're dependent on the government, and the government isn't like I don't know taking care of them, right? And I think these are like very intuitive principles. Those are like three strong principles that you can use as weighing mechanisms or simply as like a principal argument. But yeah, on the proposition, I think you can make a couple of different principles, but I don't think they're as clean as you'd see on the opposition. But that's why we're going to talk about the more advanced principles. All right. So these are less common principles that you run into, right? These are less common principles, more complex principles, things that I think could be persuasive if properly executed, but we'll just talk about it right now. So the first thing that you'll run into or that you should use sometimes is criteria principles, right? And this is just like in order for like us to grant something to someone, what criteria do they have to like fulfill, right? So for example, this house would grant AI clones and alternate life forms the full extent of constitutional rights. Ask yourself, when do we grant people rights? What is the criteria for when someone receives rights? I'd argue that it's probably A, when they're created or born in the country that they're like democratically engaging with. B, when they have enough intellectual capacity to understand politics, to know how voting works, whatever. And like C, they have to be actively impacted by the policies being passed, right? So, like, if they do not fulfill this criteria, then they probably should not be engaging in the democratic process. They have to like fit into all three of them, right? Because like, if they don't, then the government is like not fulfilling their end. They're not giving them their rights, whatever, right? That's bad. Those are the type of principles you want to make. The criteria principles can be very, very strong if your opponent doesn't actually like engage with the criteria. Secondly, though, is the intergenerational principle. And some people think that this is a common principle. I don't really see it used that much though. And the principle is just like current generations should minimize the impact they have on future generations because we would be making decisions for them if we did otherwise, right? So like on this is probably a proposition principle that you'd use on the motion that we did the drill on about making the weight of an individual's vote proportional to their remaining lifespan. Because proposition would be like, look, old people aren't going to be here to like witness the effects of the policies that they're voting for. Therefore, they probably should not be weighed as equally as someone who's going to have to live the next 100 years on this planet, right? So like that's like the sort of intergenerational principle that you'd run on that on motions like those, right? Thirdly, though, is the individual agency as a means, right? And this is an important principle. So the individual agency as a means just argues that people should have a choice because it will lead to better outcomes for them, right? So if you're debating the motion, this house would actively discourage women from having children, opposition's principle would be like, no, absolutely not. We should not discourage anyone because that interferes with their individual agency and therefore like externally influences them, right? Instead, we ought not encourage them or discourage them. We should just let them make the choice that best, like they're best suited for and best impacts their individual circumstances, right? This is good because we're giving them autonomy, and it also means that the autonomy we're giving them is leading to better outcomes for them because it's like personalized for their own situations, right? If you're debating a motion like this house would require defendants in criminal trials to be represented exclusively by public defenders, opposition would be like, absolutely not. People ought to have the right to choose who their lawyer is based on things like experience levels, specialization, race, or identity. And therefore, giving them that autonomy, allowing for them to have private attorneys based on things like specialization, race, or identity would lead to better outcomes because A, they might have a better chance at winning in court if they're able to choose who their attorney is, and B, they're able to feel more comfortable with their lawyer if it's like part of the same race, identity, whatever, right? So this is what we mean by individual agency as a means. Think of autonomy as the bridge that links the person to some good outcomes. That's basically how that principle operates. But more advanced principles, and we'll talk about three more, is just about individual agencies as an end, right? And so this is similar to autonomy as a means, except this does not rely on positive, like practical outcomes, right? So you say that people should have a choice, even if the outcomes of granting them that choice or using that choice is bad, right? Usually the warrant behind this is because they've been denied that choice since like forever, right? So think about things like abortion, right? Even if people believe that abortion is inherently bad, because we've denied women that choice for so long, or any choice really, then we ought grant them that autonomy as an end because they never had choice like to begin with, right? Things like fights for independence and sovereignty and stuff like that. Think things like Catalonia versus Spain. Like Catalonia pushing back against Spain is probably going to like lead to a whole bunch of deaths and a whole bunch of like destabilization. But because they've never had autonomy before and they've been like imperialized and colonized, we prioritize autonomy as an end and support their fights for sovereignty because even if they lose, they should still have the autonomy as an end goal, right? And so the way this looks like in actual rounds is like on the motion, this house supports a US Taiwan free trade agreement. Opposition would probably be like, no, the US should not mess with Taiwan because China will get very, very angry and act out and blow up the world, right? Or like hurt Taiwan or something, right? Whatever. A proposition principle could use this individual agency as an end by saying like, look, Taiwan has never had individual agency. They've never had sovereignty. China is literally trying to colonize Taiwan. China stops them from trading with other people. Therefore, passing a free trade agreement between the US and Taiwan is principally necessary, even if the outcomes of providing that autonomy is bad, right? Because it grants them a choice that they've never had before. And I think that that's a strong principle because it's true. Like even if China acts out, like as long as Taiwan has a decision to make instead of like always being forced to like side with China, then that's like a good principle. Secondly, though, is a retributive principle, right? And I think this is like a tough spot to be in just because I feel like a lot of times I find debaters that have or like are on a side of emotion where they have to defend retribution over things like rehabilitation or restoration or whatever, and they don't know how to properly argue it. And retribution is just the opposite of rehabilitation. It's just like eye for an eye type of things. And I think the way you argue this is just saying that regardless of whether or not it deters crime, retribution is necessary to bring justice as it is the only way to ensure that the guilty feel the pain that they inflicted on someone or something else. Therefore, it's the only way to restore the balance, right? And so retribution operates through the lens of balance and equalizing balance, right? That's how you see fairness, and that's how they characterize fairness, is through balance. And so if one individual increased suffering on another individual's life, the only way to actually achieve justice is by equalizing the suffering and making sure that the guilty actually feel the pain that they've inflicted on someone else, right? This is the universal warrant for retribution and retributive like justice and punishment. You can decide whether or not that's good. That's just how I think like you should argue it, right? The third thing though, and this is like a very advanced principle, is just like the veil of ignorance and the lottery of birth, right? And so a long time ago, there's this guy named John Rawls who believed that equality of opportunity was the end goal, because if we hid behind what he called the veil of ignorance, then we would want to equalize the playing field, right? And so basically what this means is like, just like imagine that like, I don't know, imagine that you were like a fetus or something, right? Like, I don't know, not born yet, right? You could be anyone in the world. You could be born into like I don't know, you could be born like into a Kardashian family, or you could be born into a very, very poor family in the global South, and you'd be like the seventh child or something, right? So because you do not know who you're going to be born as, because you're hiding behind what he called the veil of ignorance, you would want to equalize everyone's life and make everyone's life as equal as possible, because then you would have the best chances of living a good life. And so that's sort of the like lottery of birth type analysis that John Rawls believed in. And this is the sort of principle that you can make, where it's just like the reason you prioritize equality is because of the veil of ignorance, because you don't know who you're going to be born as. And it's unfair that someone was born like a poor person of color and can't, like, I don't know, climb the ranks in society because of that, right? Like that's sort of the analysis you use to justify equality over other things. So now let's talk about how to explicitly refute these type of principles, right? And note that it's explicitly, not strategically, right? And so whenever I say explicitly, it's just like, what are like the three responses that you're going to frontline from the O1, from the O2, right? The first thing you say is, or the first thing you try and do is delegitimize the principle, right? Well, what do you mean, right? Ask yourself, is this actually a real principle, or does it rely on practical outcomes? And if it does rely on some practical stuff, call it out. And if it's truly a fake principle and you were right to critique them, then it's going to weigh significantly less on the ballot if it weighs at all, right? The judge probably isn't going to care about it. So remember the motion about branding private schools. Proposition's hung principle would be on the right to quality education. And the reason why that's hung is because you actually have to prove that education improves in a world without private schools before you can claim that principle, right? If you cannot prove that, then it's hung, and then your opponent can call you out, and then it's whatever, right? You lose the round. So that's like the first thing you want to do, is make sure that it's actually a real principle. Secondly, though, you can stop their principle's solvency. What do you mean? Ask yourself, do they actually fulfill their principle, right? For example, if you're debating the motion, this house would cede land to indigenous populations, and they're like, we committed three evils against like the indigenous people. We took their money, we took their culture, we took their land, whatever, right? And if their only like mechanism of solvency is like giving land back, then you can argue that this doesn't actually fulfill the principle of reparations, because out of the three things that were taken from them, proposition's only giving them one thing, right? And then you could be like, this is where our counter model comes in, because we would rather give them monetary reparations. And that's better because first, it like fulfills the first thing that was taken from them, which was money. And then it also, and because money buys land, it also fulfills the third one, which is land, right? Whatever. And this is like the best way that you can like engage something comparative, stop their principal solvency, and kind of mitigate the importance of the principal argument that they make, right? The next thing is about washing their principle away, right? And we have this very nice bar of soap that will remind us how to wash principles away, right? So what do you mean by like wash their principle away? Basically, if you come from other debate formats, it's just like non-unique everything that they say. So like just argue that it can be done on both sides and it can be achieved on both sides. So if you're debating a motion about like implementing a UBI in like the US, right? And propositions makes this super terrible principle of economic sustainability. Everyone has the right to be financially stable. Everyone has the right to basic income, whatever, right? That's probably true, right? But the problem is it's non-unique, right? Because an opposition isn't going to challenge that and be like, actually, nobody deserves money or financial stability, right? They're not going to say that, right? They're going to be like, look, our counter model is welfare reform. We agree people have a right to be financially and fiscally stable, but we just disagree on the way that you actually do that, right? So we can also claim the same principle of economic sustainability. That's not the question of this debate. The question is which mechanism is the best way to get there? Is it a UBI or is it welfare reform, right? And this is like a very good tactic of just washing the principle ground away from a debate, getting rid of it, and making the judge and your opponents focus on winning the practical ground. And this is probably where you're strongest at anyway, right? So this is like a very good tactic in my opinion. The last thing that you can do is question the legitimacy of the actor enforcing it, right? So let's say you're debating this motion on like this house supports the U.S. Taiwan free trade agreement, and they make an or like proposition makes an argument about principle of reparations because Taiwan has been wronged before, right? You want to frontline a couple of questions. You want to be like, okay, well, who wronged them? Was it the U.S.? Because if it was China, then a U.S. Taiwan free trade agreement doesn't repair anything because it would have to be China in order for it to be reparations, right? It doesn't actually solve anything. Or you can ask a question like, would the U.S. actually treat them better, right? Like the U.S. isn't like that great of a person, and they would, if they mistreat Taiwan equally as like China has done before, then that's actually not a like net positive claim on the principle, right? Bad teams usually make this mistake where they don't take into consideration the legitimacy of the actor. So you're probably right to like call them out on it, right? So let's do a quick drill, right? So let's say you're debating that same motion on like Taiwan, whatever, and try to explicitly refute this principle as best you can with the stuff that we just talked about, right? So let's say, boom, I'm on the proposition of U.S. Taiwan, and I say Taiwan needs reparations or it needs like other options. Therefore, we ought to have a U.S. Taiwan like free trade agreement, right? You can pause here and think about a couple of responses. Don't take too much time because like I don't know. Well, I think it's kind of like simple. Cool. So let's see what you guys came up with. Here's what I think is like the gut instinct responses, right? So I think like firstly, what we just talked about in the last slide, right? If China wronged them, then why should the US be the ones to like have a free trade agreement? That's not reparations, whatever, right? Secondly, though, um, things like things about how Taiwan, like life in Taiwan getting better under a US Taiwan free trade agreement is actually not a true principle because it's contingent upon Taiwan's getting better like economically as a result, right? So it's not like actually a true principle. Then I think the last and final response you can give is about solvency, right? Just like trying to mitigate the solvency. Be like, does a US Taiwan free trade agreement actually solve the conditions in Taiwan? Like if Taiwan is struggling economically or through human rights, or if it's experiencing any single problem and the U.S. actually makes that worse, then that isn't a positive principle claim. That's just like a reason why you actually vote for our side of the house because that worsens the principle, right? These are the type of frontline refutations that you want to introduce, and if you like go by them like super fast and like they drop this principle argument and you're just like we have three responses, one, two, three, then you're probably going to win on like that ground, right? So now let's talk about how to strategically refute these arguments. The first thing that I think you can do is minimize the scope of the principle, right? Ask yourself, is this principle actually universal? Does everyone have access to that principle? Remember what we talked about in the first couple of slides? If it's not universal, it's not a good principle, right? So for example, a right to life is good because everyone's alive and therefore that right like is accessible to everybody who is alive. A bad example of a principle would be things like your right to choose. Remember the motion of like this house would ban private schools because that choice is contingent upon your financial stability. That's not a real choice that's accessible to everyone. Therefore, the scope of the principle is extremely minimized. And the reason why this is a good strategic response is because it forces the judge to take it less into consideration. And you're like telling the judge, this actually isn't as important on your ballot, right? Next, though, you can make this argument that like the principle is in tension with their own case, right? And usually this is like mistakes that bad teams make because they don't realize that their own principle kind of like implodes the rest of their case. So let's say you're debating this motion about this house supports 100% inheritance tax, and your principle is economic equality, right? And so you're just like everyone deserves economic equality. Generational wealth is bad because white people get a whole bunch of like properties that cost $1 billion, and therefore the government ought 100% inheritance tax it, right? But if the team that makes this principal claim also has a framework that's like 100% inheritance, but only for those who make X amount of money or over $5 million, or only for the ultra rich, then the principle's in tension with the case, right? Because you're like, well, if your principle is actually true and we oppose things like generational wealth and we oppose things like economic inequality, then why would you only apply this policy towards the richest people in society or towards people who make $5 million, but not people who make $4.9 million, right? Like this is the type of like logistical strategic response that you can give that kind of like makes them look stupid or kind of like proves that their case implodes on itself or isn't actually or like they don't actually fulfill their principle either, right? The last thing that I think you can do is prove that your principle or their principle is in tension with another more important principle, right? And this is kind of where we get into weighing, but basically you'll just be like, there's two competing principles here, and here's why you should care more about our principle, right? So like let's say you're debating the mission this house would require virtual education during a pandemic. Proposition's principle would probably be like right to safety, pandemics are bad and they're going to kill people, and opposition principles just going to be like people should have the right to choose which situation is best for them because some people work, some people can't like take care of kids at home, whatever, right? And so the way you actually resolve this is through weighing, and this is what we're going to talk about now, which is just weighing principles, right? The first thing you can do is weigh the practical against the principle, right? And this just means that like the practical harms of uplifting their principle outweighs the moral benefits of actually uplifting it in the first place, right? So you can almost always argue that the harms of their principle benefit infringe upon some other principle. So, like, let's say you're debating the motion this House believes that former colonial powers ought to have free trade agreements with former colonies. Proposition's very, very strong principle would be like reparations, right? Like, former colonies colonized a ruined, like, all these countries' economies, whatever. Therefore, there's a reparative obligation to have like free trade agreements or more trade, whatever, right? Opposition's response would just be like, look, we agree reparations need to like happen, but the problem is like free trade agreements are very, very bad at like a very, very bad way to give reparations. And that's because companies are going to move in, they're going to turn the country into a manufacturing country. That's terrible for workers and workers' rights. Labor conditions go down, and by extension, individual quality of life goes down too. And then you'll just be like, so even if you uphold reparations by giving free trade agreements, that upholding that principle infringes upon others people's rights to a high quality of life, to like stability, to whatever, and therefore that's bad, right? The practical outcomes are outweighing your principle of reparations. Another way that you can do this is like no principle, like no talk of the principle at all, and just go straight practical is more important than principle, right? Just go in on the practical. So I think like the clearest contrast is just utility versus principles, right? So on the motion, this has to require virtual education. Proposition would argue the principle of public health and safety, and opposition would argue that there is an inherent utility behind school that outweighs the loss of safety. Things like childcare, or it's better for like in-person schooling is better for kids with learning disorders, etc., is the inherent utility that it provides. And so therefore, you'd argue that like the I don't know the 50% chance that a student gets COVID in in-person school is outweighed by the inherent utility that schools have to provide, like, and then name all the utility that it does, right? And so an analogy that I like to use very commonly in rounds is about how roads are like dangerous, but we do not close them because the inherent utility they provide is worth the risk of car accidents, etc. And like that's kind of applicable to anything. And if you like draw that contrast, I think it's quite persuasive. And like a lot of judges will find themselves caring more about utility over the principle. And so here's what we talked about earlier about weighing principles against principles. This is a very difficult thing to do, but it's also a very clear contrast. And basically, all you have to do is tell the judge why your principle should be valued more than theirs, right? And I think there's two ways of doing it. Things like prerequisite analysis and the hierarchy of principles. So if you're debating the motion, this house as a doctor would prioritize longevity of life over quality of life. The competing principles are very obviously life versus quality of life. Do we care more about longevity of life, or do we care more about the value and quality of life being lived? So if you're on the proposition, the prerequisite analysis you use is, okay, quality of life is important, we agree, but living life is a prerequisite towards experiencing any quality of life in the first place. Therefore, you ought prioritize longevity of life. Then on the like the reverse of that would be on the opposition, where you're just like arguing the hierarchy and principles, and you're just like, yes, living life is a prerequisite towards experiencing quality of life. But the problem is, if you have no quality of life, then the value of like living life goes down anyway. It's not a life worth living, right? If I don't have access to like, I don't know, any of my basic needs, then that's not a life worth living. And then like longevity of life no longer matters, right? And so this is a good way, and it's a tough way to argue quality of life and why you should care more about it. But it's kind of how you weigh principles against principles. But I think that there's three explicit weighing mechanisms that you can use to weigh principles, right? So the first thing is this probability, right? Let's say you're going against a really bad principle and they're just like, and their principle relies on some impact to happen, you want to prove why that impact is improbable and why your principle is actually more probable, right? So if their principle like relies on like um, some degree of practical outcome, just say like, yo, your practical outcome is not going to happen for three reasons, one, two, three, and that's enough pushback to like decrease the probability of their principle and cast some sort of reasonable doubt upon it, right? Secondly, though, is like scope, right? Remember, use that universality to your benefit. Ask yourself, is the principle more universal? Does it affect more people? If your principle is more affects more people on net, then that's still a reason that your principle should be valued more because it's going to affect more lives. The last thing, though, is weighing on magnitude, right? Ask yourself, does the group your principal target matter more than the group that their principal targets, right? So if you're talking about like, I don't know, if you're talking about like supporting a UBI or something and using a wealth tax to fund it, and they're like, no, we shouldn't use the wealth tax because the wealthy use hard, like they worked very, very hard for their work. And you're like, no, UBIs are important because it gives like people at the bottom a chance to like meet ends meet, then you'd be like, our principle matters more because our group of people need it more than they do. Whatever, who cares about like Jeff Bezos, right? Like this is kind of like the magnitude type length that you'd give, and it's probably not going to be like against an argument like the ones that I just named, but that's kind of what you want to like think about whenever you're around. But anyway, I think that's all that I have for you guys today. Here's some very lovely resources. Second Thought, always a very dope resource. I think that they are a very good YouTube channel that covers the basis of pretty much a lot of the motions that you'll run into on the circuit. The Philosophize This podcast is also a great resource. It covers things like the basics of morals and understandings of ethics, things like Kantian ethics, John Rawlsian theory, all of that stuff are very, very good like trains of thought when it comes to what's ethical and what's not. And lastly, and the most important resource of all is my email. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out. Even if it's not about this lecture, I'm always willing to talk. So yeah, you guys have any questions, hit me up. But that's it. That's all for me. Thank you guys a whole ton for watching. Y'all are the greatest.